Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this live stream about navigating household labor together, presented by myself. I'm Alicia Walsh, a graduating counseling intern at Usaba Wellness Services. And just to give y'all a little bit more color into my background and kind of where I'm coming from, since I will be providing some personal anecdotes throughout this presentation. I am a wife and a mother of two. I have two daughters, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. So, shout out to all those other parents who may be on here navigating those early years of childhood and parenting, but also welcome anyone out there who has older children, anyone out there who doesn't have any children. Children are not a requirement to get benefits out of what we're going to discuss in this presentation. So going forward, just so you have an idea of what we'll be discussing is first, we're going to start off by talking about mental load and what that looks like and what that even is. We'll then jump into boundaries and how personal boundaries actually play a role in when it comes to divvying out household labor and tasks. Then we're going to step into building a system within your household that can help you effectively manage household tasks while also building feelings of camaraderie and partnership and equality and fairness. Then we'll dive into communication, because communication is a really important part of making sure the system stays in place and maintains in place. And then the last part, we'll dive into kind of some ways that you can start dividing responsibilities and what that would look like for you. So before I get started, I do want to mention that much of this information is coming from Eve Rodsky's Fair Play method. So I want to make sure that credit is given where credit is due. And then at the end of the presentation, I will also point you in the direction, if you really like a lot of what you heard, where you can get some more resources to kind of continue this journey when it comes to divvying out household labor. So again, the first thing I want to talk about is mental load. Some of y'all may have heard about this in the past, some of y'all may have not. So to understand mental load better, let's first take the time to kind of explore the impact of household labor imbalance. So in households worldwide, an often overlooked issue that quietly accumulates is this unequal distribution of household labor. So that means things like managing daily chores, to caring for children, and even caring for elderly family members. All these responsibilities of maintaining a household can many times disproportionately fall on one individual's shoulders. And so this phenomenon is often referred to as caregiver burden. And it kind of sheds light on this broader implication of imbalanced household labor and also the consequences it has on individuals and families. So at its core, the caregiver burden represents this hidden cost of caregiving. And you can kind of see it in this image. You see the idea of caregiving on top of the iceberg, but underneath are all these hidden costs. So individuals who assume primary caregiving roles may experience things like setbacks in their career, which can include reduced opportunities for advancement or even potential loss of income. But this impact can actually extend past financial concerns. It can also affect an individual's overall mental health, well-being, and even quality of life. So first and foremost, I want to call this out because we really need to recognize the value of caregiving as an essential work. And this involves challenging the societal norms and creating a more supportive environment for caregivers. Additionally, kind of fostering this culture of shared responsibility for household duties is extremely essential. So by encouraging this kind of open communication and collaboration within the households, we can create a more equitable partnership where caregiving responsibilities are distributed more evenly because they are valued and they are brought to the forefront. So next, I want to dive into mental load itself. So mental load refers to that invisible labor that creates like this cognitive burden that's disproportionately falls on individuals within households. This can encompass everything from managing schedules, managing finances, remembering birthdays, remembering doctor's appointments, all those little things. So while these tasks may seem small individually, collectively, they can create this significant cognitive load that can lead to stress, resentment, and even burnout. So addressing the mental load is crucial for several reasons. Firstly, it's just a matter of fairness and equality within a relationship. So when one partner carries the bulk of this mental load, it can create an imbalance and that can strain the partnership. And secondly, it's essential for our mental health and our well-being to recognize this mental load, because if we're constantly juggling countless responsibilities, this can take a toll on our mental health and our emotional resilience, which can then lead to increased stress and even a decreased satisfaction with life. And finally, the mental load has far-reaching consequences beyond just an individual and the relationship. It can even impact one's ability to thrive in their careers. It can impact their ability to pursue personal interests and even engage more fully within their community. So I always say, what does mental load inequality look like? What are things that could be happening and you could be thinking if you are experiencing this inequality? So some statements like, oh, everything falls on my shoulders. I'm always the one having to take care of things. I feel like I have no support. If you're experiencing that thought, you may be, experiencing mental load inequality. Another thought is, I'm tired of explaining how to do things. So if you feel like you're always taking things on because every time you try to give it away, someone just is not able to hear it and not able to take it on, you may be experiencing mental load inequality. Another thought is, there's just no time for me. So if you're having this thought of like every hour of the day is allocated to something to do with the household, something to do in service to someone else, and I never have time for myself, you may be experiencing mental load inequality. The idea of, I don't even know what I like anymore. So you have spent so much time putting yourself towards other people, other things, that you've lost sight of even who you are and what you like, and you haven't even had the time to explore that part of you. You may be experiencing mental load inequality. And then that last one, some people do feel this of, sometimes my partner feels like another child. So sometimes someone can find themselves in a relationship, in a partnership, where they just feel like their partner is not able to step up in the way that they need them to. And it almost feels like they're taking care of another child in the relationship. And so if you're kind of having those feelings, you may be experiencing this mental load inequality. So let's take a moment to dive a little bit deeper in why achieving equitable division of labor goes beyond just simply assigning tasks to individuals. So when we talk about division of labor going forward, we're not just talking about physical tasks like washing the dishes or doing laundry. We're also talking about that invisible labor, that mental load, that emotional burden that often goes unrecognized and even unappreciated. So this includes the cognitive load of managing schedules, like we talked about, kind of finances, family logistics, and it can even include things like emotional labor. So providing support and empathy and care for those within your family and within your relationships. So an equitable division of labor is about recognizing and valuing all those forms of labor, regardless of whether they're visible or they're not. And it's about acknowledging the contributions of each partner and ensuring that responsibilities are distributed in a way that feels fair and balanced for both parties. So in this example, I have the anatomy of a chore. So as you know, like cooking dinner isn't just the physical task of like putting the vegetables in the pan and cooking it. There's also things like the meal planning, deciding what are we going to eat this week for each specific meal, the actual grocery shopping, going out and getting the foods and making sure you have it so that you can cook the meal. Any prepping that's required when it comes to either making the meal, finding the recipes, and then the budgeting, like making sure you have the money to buy the food needed to then cook the meal. So all of that goes into meal planning. And we don't always look at that because we kind of forget about it. And we look directly at the execution part of just, making that chicken that night. So next, we're going to explore some contributing factors to unfair mental load. And understanding these factors is crucial for identifying and addressing the root causes of inequality in household management. So the first one, and one of the primary factors contributing to unfair mental load, can sometimes be gender norms and even societal expectations. So from a young age within our culture right here, we're kind of socialized to believe that certain tasks are inherently women's work and other tasks are reserved for men. And so, kind of these ingrained stereotypes can create an unconscious bias that can influence how we perceive and distribute household responsibilities. Another one is kind of the previous role of caregivers and parents in your life. So often individuals can carry forward the caregiving responsibilities they observed in their own families growing up. And this can result in an unequal distribution of labor when one partner is taking on more of the mental load based on their past experiences and their expectations. Another one is this overfunctioning, underfunctioning dynamic. So in some relationships, one partner may take on the role of an overfunctioner, assuming responsibilities for managing all the aspects of household life, while the other partner then becomes the underfunctioner, relying heavily on their partner to take care of everything. And so, as you can imagine, this imbalance can lead to resentment and frustration, even on both sides, because sometimes, even the underfunctioner may feel like they're not contributing or they don't feel valued. Like there's just different ways that this dynamic can create resentment within the partnership. Another one is difficulties when it comes to communication. This can further exacerbate the problem. And in some cases, partners may struggle to effectively communicate their needs and expectations. And this can lead to misunderstandings and future frustrations, because without those clear boundaries in place, it's really easy for one partner to become overwhelmed by the mental load, while the other one remains and can remain unaware of the extent of the burden that their partner is experiencing. And then lastly, this kind of idea of limited effective systems for managing household responsibilities can also contribute to an unfair mental load, because without clear systems in place for delegating tasks and tracking responsibilities and sharing the workload, it's extremely easy for one partner to end up bearing the brunt of the mental load, while the other partner, again, may remain oblivious to the lack of contributions that they're providing. So now we're going to jump into boundaries. They can sometimes act as barriers to addressing the mental load. So some of y'all might have, previous experience with understanding boundaries, but for those who don't, boundaries are extremely essential for maintaining balance and protecting our well-being within relationships, because they help us, went too far. Because they help us define our limits, and then they help us communicate our needs. And they also help us assert our autonomy. However, when it comes to the mental load, boundaries can sometimes become blurred or even disregarded, and that can lead to an imbalance as well as resentment. And when it comes to labor division, our time boundary is the one that's kind of like circled right here in a more pink color. This is the boundary that can typically get overlooked and the one that can kind of get blurred. So we'll talk about that a lot in this presentation. So the one thing I'm going to talk about is this belief that all time is created equal. And this suggests that each partner's time and contribution should be valued equally within the relationship. However, in practice, this may not often be the case. And that's because the mental load can sometimes disproportionately fall on one partner, leaving them with less time and less energy for their own personal pursuits and their own personal interests. And this imbalance can erode boundaries and lead to feelings of frustration. And again, these feelings of resentment. And so kind of this example I have is, we all only have 24 hours in a day. That is the same across every person. So an example that can happen many times is each partner may have 3 hours at the end of the day to dedicate to themselves. And in one case, one partner is able to spend those hours, with self-care towards themselves and doing something they enjoy, while the other partner may be spending those times in service to the home. And so if this is what's happening, this is an example of inequitable labor. And that's because each partner deserves the same amount of time for self-care. And so one thing I always say is don't guard your partner's time by devaluing your own time. So if you find yourself, guarding your partner's time and making sure they have enough self-care time, but it's in detriment to yourself, have enough self-care time, then you're inadvertently creating this kind of unequitable labor. So next I'm going to jump into a few myths that kind of perpetuate this unequitable division. So one myth may be my partner makes more money than I do. And so one thing I say to that is we need to stop devaluing household labor. So many times this happens because one partner may be the breadwinner and one partner may be staying at home, or they may be making less, but that partner is still putting a lot of work towards the house, and that work needs to be valued. And also, and I say this across all partnerships, that in all people, that you deserve to prioritize yourself regardless of what your partner makes. So even though your partner may be the breadwinner, it doesn't mean that you aren't able to take time, or you shouldn't be allowed time for yourself. So again, when you start to feel that way, remind yourself you do deserve it, even though you may make less or you may not be bringing in money. That's okay. It doesn't mean you don't deserve time for yourself. Another myth that happens is this idea of, well, my job is more flexible, so I'm going to take on more of the household labor. And so to that, I say that a flexible job doesn't necessarily mean infinite or more time, because sometimes people are like, well, my job is remote, so I can take on more household labor, or my job, I have a more flexible schedule. But those things don't necessarily mean that you have more than 24 hours a day to do something. That just means you're a little bit more flexible in how you do it. So be a little careful when you start to think about that and you start taking on more household labor because of a flexible schedule or a flexible work location, because you may actually be, again, another unequitable situation for yourself. Another myth is, in the time it takes me to tell my partner to do something, I could just do it myself. And I hear that a lot. And it's a really frustrating feeling, because you're like, it's going to take me an hour to explain this when I can just get it done in 10 minutes. But what happens then is you are now unintentionally devaluing your future time. Because if you take time to teach someone, this will free you up in the future to do other things. And so it's a really hard concept in the moment to know, like, oh, I'm going to spend time doing this. But again, this is now providing value to your future self and your future time. So try not to get stuck in that myth and, again, cause that inequality in labor. And the last one that I have, and this is a really interesting one that I hear as well, is I am wired better for multitasking. And I find that one so interesting because it's almost like, in a way, taking pride in being able to stretch yourself thin, which is great. I understand that it's really cool to be able to know you can do a lot of things, you can handle things on your own, but you want to be careful that you're not always putting yourself in the situation that you're constantly stretching yourself thin, and then you're rationalizing it as, well, I'm just the better person to do this in a relationship. I'm the one that can manage stretching myself thin, because that's not a state of being you want to be constantly in. So whenever you hear that, like, well, I'm wired better for multitasking, maybe that's true. Maybe you are a better multitasker, but it doesn't mean that you need to take on more things and kind of keep yourself in this really multitasking, stretched thin world. So the last thing I want to talk to when it comes to boundaries is this kind of necessity of self-care and personal fulfillment. So in order to address barriers to mental load and to labor inequity, it's essential for both partners to recognize the importance of their boundaries and actively work to maintain them. Oh, I did it again. Went 2 slides ahead. And so this may kind of involve things like setting aside dedicated time for self-care. It may involve communicating openly about individual needs and limitations, as well as even like redistributing responsibilities in a way that honors each partner's time. So being able to like foster this culture of mutual respect, understanding, and support, partnerships can create these healthier boundaries around mental load and cultivate a more balanced, fulfilling partnership. So if you take anything away from today, it is you deserve time for self-care, and self-care is really needed when it comes to setting your own personal boundaries. So kind of going further of now we've understand kind of like what causes inequity, ways that we can kind of help build our own boundaries. Now we're going to jump into, building a system. So in like the realm of household management, the traditional like strategies usually often fall short because they keep perpetuating these imbalances and frustrations within partnerships. So things like to-do lists and calendars, though they may be great, they don't necessarily address this imbalance. So many of these strategies actually perpetuate those underlying issues of resentment and unequal labor. So one thing I always like to say is, what if we approach our homes as the most important organizations in our lives? And this question is there kind of to serve as this foundation for a new approach to household management that's rooted in explicit expectations, understood roles, fairness, and transparency, as well as central to this approach is this concept of accountability and trust. So, like a well run organization, household management requires each partner to take ownership of their assigned tasks from conception all the way to execution. And this ownership mindset ensures that the responsibilities are not just delegated, but are fully embraced. And that leads against that more equitable feeling within the partnership. So, one key aspect to this new approach is understanding these 3 steps. So, conception, planning, and execution. And these concepts play a crucial role in redefining household responsibilities and achieving equitable partnerships. So, the first one that we're going to talk about is conception. And conception involves the initial idea or thought process behind a household task. So, this stage looks like partners taking the time to consider what needs to be done and why it's important. So, an example I'm pulling is the task of planning a family vacation. In the conception stage, this may involve discussing potential locations, setting a budget, and considering everyone's preferences and schedules. And so, this conception phase is all about identifying the need for a task and then the beginnings of laying the groundwork that leads to execution. So the next stage is planning. And so this planning phase encompasses all the very detailed organization and preparation required to make sure the household task is effectively executed. So during this stage, partners work together to develop that clear plan of action, as well as outlining any specific steps that are needed, allocating any resources that are needed. And in this example of the family vacation, this stage may involve things like going and even researching the travel, figuring the options for travel, booking the accommodations, where you're going to stay, arranging the transportation, creating the itinerary. So all these small details that go into making sure the execution executes efficiently. And then so that leads us to execution. So this is the stage that is the more visible part of a household task that people think about, because this refers to the actual implementation and completion of a household task. And this stage involves carrying out the entire plan that was developed during the planning phase, and then ensuring that all necessary steps are followed through completion. So back to that family vacation example, this stage may involve packing bags. It may involve traveling to the destination and doing the planned activities, and even like addressing any, unforeseen challenges that pop up. And so this phase is all about putting plans into action and then seeing them through to the desired outcome. So one example, again, we were talking about this idea of an ownership mindset. And that ownership mindset is the idea that someone owns everything from conception through execution, because the conception and planning phase is where there's a lot of that mental load that's going, it's invisible. So, but there are times that a partnership may not be practicing an ownership mindset. And so an example of this can be around the household task of like children's recreational activities. So while one partner may be like, hey, I handle the recreational activities, that's my job, I'm doing a great job, there may only be actually handling the execution stage. So they may be the one that's like taking the children to sports practices and bringing them home. But the other partner may be still managing the conception and the planning. And so those pieces look like tasks like researching the different sports options, organizing logistics, being on like, a 1,000-person text chain with all the other parents in the team, getting the uniforms, signing the release forms, all that stuff that goes into it. That one person may still be holding all that mental load. And so it's important, to recognize that one person needs to own that full process. And it's really essential for creating that balance or equitable division of labor, or you end up with that, unequal feeling of like, yeah, you're taking them to sports practices, but I'm doing all these other things that it doesn't really seem to sync up for us. So one crucial element in challenging, this idea of any faulty beliefs is this idea of acceptable level task of completion. So often partners may have differing views on what constitutes a necessary task, and even what constitutes appropriate timing for something being completed. And so by developing kind of this shared understanding of the minimum standards that are needed for each household task, the couples can align their values and expectations and create a more harmonious partnership because, they're both on the same page. So creating an acceptable level of care involves things like setting clear expectations and agreements regarding this level of care. And so let's kind of use the example of washing dishes to kind of walk us through that. So when it comes to washing dishes in the conception phase, the process will begin with both partners discussing the importance of maintaining a clean and functional kitchen because they agree that keeping a kitchen tidy is essential for the overall hygiene of their home and even for their own peace of mind. So they've decided, yes, it is important to clean dishes. In the planning phase, partners would collaborate to then determine how they're going to approach dishwashing. So they'll discuss things like, when should the dishes be washed? How should they be washed? Are some dishes hand washed? Are some dishes okay to go in the dishwasher? And even who will be responsible for each task. So like I said, kind of going back to that ownership mindset is one person will probably take on, like, I'm going to manage household dishes. So they're kind of running this like a project manager, like in this stage, they're doing the conception, the plan execution, but you're completely okay to bring in your partner for collaboration, especially when it comes to acceptable level of completion. You really want to be able to bring your partner in so you both know. But again, there may be someone who owns dishes who's more of a project manager mindset and has that full ownership mindset. So in execution, with the plan in place, the partners will then divide the task for washing dishes. And that may look like one partner is responsible for rinsing and loading dishes while the other one washes hands. Maybe one partner does all the washing. They agree, maybe one person unloads or they both unload, but all these things are set and figured out and executed. So kind of going further into this acceptable level of completion, I want to talk kind of like, what do some of these standards look like? What's an example of like things you can determine? So an acceptable level of completion for dishes could be things like you determine rinsing and loading. Who does that? What goes in? When do we run the dishwasher? When do we not run the dishwasher? What is washed by hand? What isn't washed by hand? Well, who does the washing by hand? Who unloads? When do we unload? Do we do this daily? Do we do this every other day? Is it multiple times a day? And then, for example, in washing dishes, some couples may decide that, cleaning off surfaces is also part of that process. So who does that? When do we do that? What does that look like? So all these different things can be determined within this completion. So now both partners are on the same page to know this is what we want from dishwashing. If you can hit these levels of completion, you've done a great job. Perfect. So in all of this, we're now going to talk about communication because effective communication within households is absolutely essential for putting any of this into place. However, many families tend to struggle communicating effectively, especially about household responsibilities. And that, again, can lead to that tension, leads to misunderstandings. So I have a kind of a thorough list of the do's and the don'ts when it comes to effectively communicating. So one is communicate openly. So be transparent about your feelings. I always say sometimes our inside voice says one thing and then our outside voice says something else. Like, try to make sure that your inside voice matches your outside voice when you have conversations about household labor, so you're not harboring any resentment that you didn't realize you're experiencing. Again, establish clear expectations. We talked about that with standard level of care. Like, you need to make sure expectations are clearly defined so each partner knows what their roles are and what they need to do to hit them. Another good thing when it comes to communication is setting regular check-ins. So that could be a weekly family meeting, that could be daily check-ins at the end of the day, but set times that you do talk about household labor in ways that, maybe there's challenges that week or something was going good, but try to set it and schedule it and don't do it in the moment. Because sometimes if we try to be as constructive and kind as we can in the moment, you may be in an environment where, like, well, your partner's trying to wash the dishes, but the kids are screaming and things are going crazy. No matter how you say something, it's going to sit really weird with them because they're just not in a moment to receive it. So if you set those times to get together, knowing we're going to talk about this, y'all are going to be in a much better mental space to sit down and calmly and discuss it. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. Another one is so important, is express appreciation, even if it's something so simple. But it's so nice to hear someone say, hey, thanks for doing the dishes. Like, even if you did the dishes every day, it's so nice to hear that. Or thanks for making dinner tonight. Like, awesome. And so a little anecdote from my own life is my husband is really good about saying, oh, thanks for making dinner. Thanks for making breakfast. It looks good. And he's done it so often that now my 3-year-old will do the same thing. And I'll hear like, oh, thanks, Mom, for making breakfast. And that really warms the soul. So try to foster that environment of appreciation and do it often, because it's just a really good feeling and helps people keep motivated and know that their work is being recognized. And then the last one is problem solve together. So I always say this, openly communicate. And if there is a challenge, work together and collaborate on finding a solution. Because if both people and both partners are bought in on the solution, it's going to be much easier to execute. And so some of the don't categories is don't assume. This goes back into expectations. So if you sit there and you see that your partner's not doing something that you expect, sit there for a second and be like, did we talk about this? Because it's possible that we didn't talk about this. And then you're assuming that they know. And we shouldn't assume that our partners know everything, because they're not mind readers and you're not mind readers as well. So if you notice something's going awry, have the conversation. Don't assume that they know and sit there stewing about it. Another one is the blame game. So try really hard to refrain from blaming or criticizing. If something's going on, don't attack their character. So if they hadn't been taking the trash out when they should, don't be like, man, you're just so lazy. I cannot believe you can't even take the trash out. Like, that's criticizing, that's blaming, that's attacking their character, and no one's going to respond well to that. But so instead, be something like, hey, I've noticed you haven't taken the trash out, and we decided that taking the trash out happens on every Wednesday or something. What's going on? Just state what you've seen and then ask what's happening. And they can tell you the story of what's going on. They may be overwhelmed. They may have just forgotten, but don't try to sit there and build their own story and build their own meaning. Let them tell you. Another one is this kind of like silent resentment. So this happens as well. This kind of feeling of, oh, my partner just isn't doing this, but you're not telling them. And you're sitting there and stewing and you're stewing and stewing. So again, let your inside voice be your outside voice, and let your outside voice be compassionate and considerate when you express it. Don't let it sit there silently. Another one is don't micromanage. And this one's kind of hard sometimes, especially if you're an overfunctioner, releasing some tasks, because you may want to do it exactly the way you're doing it, and you see your partner doing it completely different. And you're like, oh, what are you doing? Which makes sense, it happens. But that's why we have standard level expectations, so that if your partner is hitting those expectations, if they're getting the dishes done how y'all decided, it doesn't matter if they're doing it in a different way. It doesn't matter if they're doing it while they're listening to yodeling or they're yodeling, let them do it. Let them have the thing. So try not to micromanage. And on the flip side, when you don't micromanage, you're releasing some of that mental load, and it feels great. So give it a try. And the last one is ignoring feedback. So it's hard. It's hard to get feedback, and even when it comes in a constructive fashion, but try really hard not to ignore it. Any concerns that are coming from your partner, listen and understand, and know that they're being vulnerable enough to communicate with you, so you can be vulnerable enough to receive it. And it's really helpful, and that's how positive changes are made. So this next area I like to talk about is family meetings. So I talked about having distinguished times to talk about household labor. So I usually recommend a cadence of, could be like a weekly meeting. You have Friday night whenever it's calm, or maybe you have it during dinner or something. And let's have it set down a time that you're like, okay, we're going to meet and we're going to discuss things that have been going on the past week, any challenges, and how can we address it? Sometimes when we're starting new household task and labor division, we want to do this more on a daily basis, because there's a lot more changes and challenges, and we want to kind of meet then as well. So it's kind of up to you, whatever feels right. Again, provide constructive feedback, refrain from judgment, refrain from being defensive, and again, collaborate and brainstorm, work together to solve solutions, because that's extremely vital in order to get buy-in from both parties. And then my last little bullet is like, if your children are old enough, especially if they are contributing to chores, invite them into these family meetings. It's actually really good for them to sit there and be part of that and kind of feel like a team. Again, if they're on the younger side, maybe they don't stay the whole meeting because their attention span just isn't going to be there. And you can just kind of bring in their pieces and then release them into the world, and let them go play while you finish up. Maybe you just have mini meetings with them, however that works for you, but really consider getting children involved in this process as well. Okay, so the next slide is when mistakes happen. And so for this, I have a story for everyone. So one evening, As the family gathered around the dinner table, the topic of the tooth fairy arose. And their youngest child, eager to share their excitement, proudly announced that they had lost their first tooth and couldn't wait for the tooth fairy to visit. As the parents exchanged knowing glances, it became clear that the responsibility of playing the role of tooth fairy had fallen through the cracks. So, determined to rectify the situation, the father, and we're going to give him the name of Mark, volunteered to take over the task of being the tooth fairy. So together, Mark and his partner sat down to discuss the acceptable level of completion for this new responsibility. They agreed that the tooth fairy should leave a small token of appreciation under the pillow in exchange for the tooth, and that it's important to do this in order to uphold this tradition for their child's sake. So, of course, the day arrived and the evening fell. And as you can imagine where this story is going, Mark found himself caught up in a whirlwind of daily tasks and responsibilities. And amidst the hustle and bustle, he completely forgot about the tooth fairy duty. His partner discovered his oversight later the next morning. However, instead of lashing out in frustration and disappointment, she approached Mark with compassion, understanding, and curiosity for what happened. So Mark, recognizing the importance of maintaining trust and integrity within their partnership, immediately took ownership, apologized for his mistake, and assured his partner that he would rectify the situation and make sure the tooth fairy visit would not be missed. Thinking quickly, Mark decided to email the tooth fairy explaining the situation. To their surprise, they received an email from the tooth fairy expressing understanding and empathy for the situation. The tooth fairy assured them that while they were unable to make it that night, they would visit the following night and with the double amount of money as a gesture of goodwill. So true to his word, Mark ensured that the tooth fairy visit was not missed. The next evening, he left double the amount of money under the child's pillow, accompanied by a handwritten note. And then as the child woke up the next morning with joy in their eyes, Mark and his partner shared a knowing smile, knowing that they had not only upheld their cherished tradition, but also reaffirmed their trust and understanding within their partnership. So again, that's just a lovely story, but it shows a lot of key things of what to do when someone makes a mistake, because we are all human and you're going to make a mistake and your partner's going to make a mistake, and we want to be able to recover from that. So things that you saw in the story was Mark recognized and accepted when he made a mistake. He took responsibility for his actions. He and his partner discussed the mistake and found a solution, as well as they kind of took time to identify what went wrong. It wasn't mentioned here, but I'm sure they probably also talked about ways to prevent this mistake from happening in the future. Mark offered an apology, which was really important. In this case, this didn't happen, but it's something to keep in mind is when mistakes happen, especially if they're happening over and over again, that maybe a reassessment of the division of labor needs to be thought through, because maybe someone is getting overwhelmed or something's changed in the schedule or something's going on that's making it difficult for that partner to hit the expectations. And also, what's really important that this entire story showed was you need to make sure that you're providing support to your partner when they make mistakes. Again, his partner reached out with compassion, reached out with curiosity, reached out with understanding, didn't reach out with blame or criticism, because she knows or he knows that they all make mistakes, and that's okay. So this next area we're going to dive into is the last one, and it's dividing responsibilities within the household. So like, Alicia, how do I even go about that? There's just so many things that we do. Totally understand. You're not wrong. Here are some ways to kind of help in that process. So first is just completing an entire compilation, comprehensive list of all the tasks that happen within your household. And this might be a list that you start one day and you keep adding to, because as life goes on, you realize, wow, we do a lot of things. I got to add it in here. You don't think about the tooth fairy. You don't think about Christmas. Who does Christmas planning? Who does Easter planning? Who does all of that? So that list may be growing, and that's okay. But the first thing you got to do is just start writing it out. The next one, and you can maybe do this first, it is easier, but you want to categorize them into things like cooking, cleaning, childcare, household. And that just kind of helps make it easier for you to refer to in the future, but also it kind of helps you, like if you're like, okay, here's the cooking category. Now let me think about everything that has to do with cooking. Sometimes it helps to kind of like start the category first. So it's really up to you. And then this is really important. Start to rank tasks by frequency and time, because daily tasks are very different than a once a year task or a once a month task. So you want to be able to understand the frequency of each task so that you know how it's going to affect the overall workload involved in maintaining the house. So now that you've identified all the tasks, you have to start assigning them to each partner. So one thing really important, consider individual preferences. So have a communication with your partner to discuss what tasks do they like to do, what tasks do they not like to do, and kind of go from there, because we all have things we love and things we do not love. Like, I'm not a big fan of laundry, not my favorite. Good to know. And I'm going to kind of jump to the shared personal perspectives, the third one, because within that individual preference, sometimes you're going to learn that your partner has different perspectives of a household task. So one thing for me, I don't like car things. I don't like taking care of car things. Car things are intimidating to me. And as a thing in my past that I remember is my dad would always take care of car things. And when I had a car as a teenager, he was always like helping make sure it would get the oil change and all this stuff. And that just made me feel super loved. So for me, having someone take on car things makes me feel super loved. So something I shared, and it's a reason why I don't own car task in the household. Another one is reflect on time availability. So again, kind of with that frequency of things, when do things happen, make sure you consider each partner's schedule and availability. This is something that if you do have a remote job or a flexible schedule, you can bring that in there. That's completely fine. Again, doesn't mean you take on all the tasks, but it means that maybe certain tasks are more reasonable for you to do because you're at home, you're working from home, or because your schedule is more flexible. And the last one is, now that's been divided, how do you maintain it? So things that's really important is to be open to compromise. So finding a balance between each partner's preferences and strengths, and recognizing that, you know what, you may have to take on a household task you don't love, and that's okay. It's going to be hard, but it's okay. So being able to compromise in that way. Another one is being able to document preference and assignment. So this is really important. I say, if you're going to go through all this work of dividing labor and writing all down, please document it. Please put it somewhere that each partner can reference, and have it somewhere that you can go back and change as well. But just having this place for reference is really helpful when it comes to kind of keeping accountability moving forward, and also making changes later. And then the next one, again, speaking of making changes later, is make sure to regularly assess and adjust. So that means that you're going to periodically revisit the division of labor. Sometimes you may have to, because circumstances change in life, and so you have to go back and revisit it. So maybe a partner is extremely overworked at their job. They can't take on as many. Maybe you get a new job. Maybe things happen in life. And so when that happens, you want to be able to be flexible and kind of reassess where needed. So to kind of end, if y'all really enjoyed a lot of these concepts and these strategies that were talked about in this session, I highly recommend you kind of dive further in a few of the Fair Play resources out there. So you can find these at fairplaylife.com. So one is, there is a book that discusses all of this in detail called Fair Play. So highly recommend looking that up. Another one which is really interesting is a documentary that's being created called Fair Play. Obviously, it's really interesting because it dives into a lot of stuff we talked at the beginning with the caregiver burden and, all time being created equal. And so that's kind of, if you want to sit down and watch a documentary about this and learn more, that's a good way to go. And then another thing that's really cool is, if the idea of like figuring out all the different household tasks sounds really daunting, there's actually a card set developed that you can use, and it kind of gamifies the process. So it has all these cards with different things and each chore, and then different things you can talk about. So that's kind of a really fun way to help you strategize that you and your partner can do together, that if it seems daunting on your own, this is a good tool to use. So thank y'all. That's the end of this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. It's something I'm very passionate about, and I hope you all got some helpful information. Now, I do know that there may or may not be comments. So let me see. Oh, there they are. So I'm going to go take a moment to look through comments, see if there's any questions that I can answer. I love that. Michael Reimer says, I love washing dishes, so I'll definitely always do that. We need people like you, Michael Reimer. What else? So thanks for all the positive comments, great information. Jenny, I'm glad these examples were helpful and make it relatable. Good, that was the goal. That was the goal of this. Oh, and Elizabeth, love the approach. Thanks. Okay, I don't see any comments. I'll give y'all a minute. If y'all have any specific comments you want to ask after hearing this, feel free to let me know. I appreciate the good vibes as well. So I'll give y'all a moment. Thanks, guys. Okay. I don't see any comments currently, but I will definitely jump on where I can, just in the social media realm, and answer if any pop up after the session. Always happens to do that in hindsight. But with that being said, that's the end of this presentation. So thank you all again for joining us, and have a good day.